Sometimes family leaves you something that changes your life, and sometimes they leave you nothing but questions and a patch of worthless ground. When Ivy and Maeve Callahan inherited a remote island, they thought it was the latter. The place was barren and forgotten. Locals called it Starvation Rock, but the sisters went anyway because it was all they had. Then they found carvings in the cliffs, strange symbols that led to hidden gold and relics from men who disappeared long ago. The island wasn't worthless at all, and once others heard about the treasure, strangers started showing up with their own claims. What happened to the people who searched for this gold before them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a man in a wrinkled suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ivy Callahan signed for it at the door of the small apartment she shared with her sister, turning the cream-colored envelope over in her hands. The return address belonged to a law firm she'd never heard of, in a town 300 miles up the coast. What is it? Maeve called from the kitchen, where she was making coffee in the old percolator that had been their mother's. Legal correspondence. Ivy carried it to the table, studying the precise lettering. From Harrington and Sons, attorneys at law. Maeve appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was younger by 3 years, with the same auburn hair as Ivy, but a lighter spirit, one that hadn't yet been worn down by practical concerns and unpaid bills. Well, open it. Maybe someone left us a fortune. The joke felt hollow. Their mother had passed 6 months earlier after a long illness that had drained what little savings the family possessed. The funeral expenses still sat on Ivy's desk, a stack of invoices she paid down bit by bit from her salary at the county records office. Maeve worked nights at a diner, bringing home tips that sometimes made the difference between paying the electric bill and eating that week. Ivy slid her finger under the envelope seal and extracted a single sheet of heavy paper. She read it once, then again, her brow furrowing. What? Maeve set down 2 mugs of coffee and leaned over Ivy's shoulder. It's about Uncle Dermot. Uncle Dermot. Maeve's voice lifted in surprise. I barely remember him. Didn't he live up north somewhere? He did. Apparently he passed away last month. Ivy scanned the formal language. It says here he's left us something in his will. Maeve pulled out a chair and sat down hard. Left us what? An island. The words hung in the air between them. Maeve's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. An island. What kind of island? Ivy read the relevant passage aloud. The property known as Hardwick Isle, comprising approximately 42 acres of land located off the coast near the town of Cragmore, is hereby bequeathed to Ivy Rose Callahan and Maeve Catherine Callahan, to be held jointly in perpetuity. She looked up. There's a note at the bottom. It says the property has been in the family for generations, but has remained undeveloped and largely uninhabited. So it's worthless, Maeve said flatly. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. If it was worth something, someone would have developed it already. But despite her words, there was a spark in Maeve's eyes, a flicker of possibility that Ivy recognized. Her sister had always been the dreamer, the one who saw potential where others saw obstacles. Ivy folded the letter carefully. We should at least go look at it. The firm says we need to sign some papers anyway, and they're located in Cragmore. When? Whenever we can get away. I can probably take a few days next week, Maeve grinned. An island. Can you imagine? Our own island. Don't get excited. It's probably a rock in the middle of nowhere. Still, it's ours. That afternoon, Ivy called the law firm and made an appointment. The woman who answered had a brisk, efficient voice and confirmed they could come the following Tuesday. Yes, they could visit the island. Yes, the firm could arrange transportation if needed. No, she couldn't provide much detail about the property's condition, beyond saying it had a small cottage that might or might not be habitable. The week passed slowly. Ivy researched Cragmore and found it was a fishing town of about 2,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noted with interest. Hardwick Isle itself barely appeared on maps, just a small, irregular shape off the coast, with no roads, no ferry service, no infrastructure at all. She found a few references in historical records. The island had been surveyed in the 1850s and had changed hands several times over the decades, but there was remarkably little information about it. One article from a regional history website mentioned it had been used briefly as a fishing station, then abandoned. Another called it Starvation Rock and said the soil was too poor for farming and the waters around it too treacherous for reliable fishing. "Listen to this," she told Maeve one evening. "There's a local legend that the island is cursed. Anyone who tries to make a living there fails within a year." Maeve laughed. "Perfect. We inherit a cursed island. That sounds about right for our luck." But Ivy noticed her sister was packing a bag with unusual care, folding clothes and making lists of supplies. Maeve wanted to believe in this, wanted to imagine that their forgotten uncle had left them something meaningful. And maybe, Ivy thought, that belief was worth more than the island itself. They drove north on Tuesday morning in Ivy's aging sedan, following the coastal highway as it wound through pine forests and past rocky beaches. The landscape grew wilder as they travelled, the towns smaller and farther apart. By late afternoon they reached Cragmore, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a natural harbour where fishing boats bobbed at anchor. The law office occupied the second floor of a building overlooking the water. Mr. Harrington himself met them, a man in his 70s with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He shook their hands and offered them seats in his cluttered office. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. Dermot was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but he was always fair in his dealings. "We didn't know him well," Ivy admitted. "When did he pass?" 6 weeks ago. "Heart attack," they said. "Quick and painless, which is a mercy." Harrington shuffled through papers on his desk. "He came to me about a year ago to update his will. Said he wanted to make sure the island went to family, specifically to you too." "Did he say why?" Maeve leaned forward. "Just that you were the only relatives he had left who might appreciate what it represented." Harrington found the document he was looking for and slid it across the desk. "The island itself has no monetary value to speak of. The county assessment puts it at maybe $5,000, mostly for the land itself. The cottage is ancient and probably not safe to occupy without repairs." Ivy scanned the deed. Her uncle's signature was at the bottom, along with a notary's seal. "Can we see it?" "I was hoping you'd ask. I've arranged for Captain Finnegan to take you out there tomorrow morning if the weather holds. He knew your uncle fairly well. Used to ferry him back and forth when Dermot was doing his research." "Research?" Ivy looked up sharply. Harrington nodded. Dermot was something of an amateur historian. Spent years looking into local maritime history, shipwrecks, that sort of thing. The island was part of his research, I gathered, though he never shared the details with me. They signed the papers, and Harrington gave them directions to the harbour where they'd meet Captain Finnegan at dawn. He also provided a key to the cottage, a heavy iron thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Fair warning," Harrington said as they stood to leave. "The locals aren't fond of the island. You'll hear stories. Most of it's superstition, but people around here have long memories." "What kind of stories?" Maeve asked. "Oh, the usual. Ships that vanished, salvage crews that left in the middle of the night, that sort of thing. I wouldn't pay it much mind, but you should know what you're walking into." They found a small inn near the harbour and checked in for the night. The proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Chen, raised her eyebrows when they mentioned Hardwick Isle, but said nothing beyond giving them directions to a decent restaurant down the street. At dinner, Ivy noticed how the other patrons glanced at them with open curiosity. Small-town life, she thought. Two strangers were probably the most interesting thing to happen all week. Maeve was unusually quiet, picking at her fish and chips. Finally she said, "What if it's really nothing? What if we came all this way for a patch of rocks?" "Then we'll know," Ivy said gently. "And we'll have a story to tell. An island we owned for exactly 1 day before we sold it to the first person who'd take it. You always know what to say." "Not always. But I know we owe it to Uncle Dermot to at least look. He wanted us to have it for a reason." That night, lying in the narrow bed in their shared room, Ivy listened to the foghorn in the harbour and thought about inheritance. What people left behind said something about who they were and who they hoped you'd become. Her mother had left them recipes and photo albums and a percolator that made terrible coffee but reminded them of Sunday mornings. What had Uncle Dermot seen in them that made him choose an island as his legacy? She fell asleep still wondering and dreamed of grey water and distant shores. Dawn came cold and clear. They dressed in layers and carried their bags down to the harbour, where Captain Finnegan waited beside a sturdy fishing boat that had seen better decades. He was a man of about 60, weathered by sun and wind, with a grey beard and eyes that assessed them with the same careful attention he probably gave to his nets and rigging. "You the Callahan sisters?" His voice was rough but not unkind. "That's us," Ivy said. "Thank you for taking us out. Dermot was a friend. Least I can do." He helped them aboard and stowed their bags in the small cabin. "Fair warning, it's about an hour run, and the water's choppy today. You get seasick?" "Never have," Maeve said cheerfully. Finnegan grunted and started the engine. The boat chugged away from the dock, through the harbour and out into open water. True to his word, the swells were significant, the boat rising and falling with a rhythm that took some getting used to. Ivy gripped the rail and focused on the horizon, an old trick for maintaining equilibrium. As they travelled, Finnegan pointed out landmarks along the coast. That was where the old cannery used to be. That cove was good for crabbing. That rocky point had claimed 3 boats in his lifetime alone. He spoke economically, not wasting words, but there was a pride in his knowledge that Ivy appreciated. Finally, he pointed ahead. "There, that's your island." It rose from the water like something from a storybook, all grey rock and dark green vegetation. Steep cliffs on the seaward side gave way to a more gradual slope facing the mainland. Ivy could make out a small beach of sorts, more pebbles than sand, and the peak of a roof among the trees. "Not much to look at," Finnegan said, "but it's solid ground. That's worth something." He brought the boat around to a rickety dock on the island's eastern shore. The wood was grey and splintered, but it held as they stepped off and secured the lines. Finnegan said he'd be back before sunset to collect them, giving them the day to explore. "You need anything? There's flares in the cottage," he said. "But you should be fine. Place is empty. Has been for years." They watched him motor away, the sound of the engine fading until they were left with just the wind and the cry of gulls. Ivy turned to face the island properly for the first time. A narrow path led up from the dock through overgrown grass and patches of wild roses. The cottage sat about 100 yards inland, a small structure of weathered stone and timber with a sagging porch and shuttered windows. Ivy fitted the heavy key into the lock and pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and salt and old wood. The cottage was a single large room with a fireplace at one end, a few pieces of furniture covered in canvas sheets, and shelves lined with books and papers. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft under the eaves. Maeve pulled the sheets off a table and chairs, raising clouds of dust that sparkled in the light coming through the door. "Well, it's rustic. It's been abandoned for a while." Ivy examined the fireplace, finding it clean of debris. Someone had maintained it, at least minimally. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of a man she vaguely recognized, Uncle Dermot, younger than she remembered him, standing on what looked like this very beach. The shelves drew her attention next. The books were mostly local histories, maritime references, charts and maps. Among them, she found several leather-bound journals, their pages covered in her uncle's careful handwriting. She pulled one down and opened it at random. The entry was dated 3 years earlier. "Return to the island today. The markings on the north cliff face are clearer after the winter storms. I believe I'm getting closer to understanding the pattern. If I'm right about the resolve, everything changes. Sivy, come look at this." Maeve stood by the window, looking out toward the cliffs. Ivy joined her and saw what had caught her sister's attention. From this angle you could see the rock face clearly, and even from a distance there were marks on it. Not natural weathering, but deliberate cuts and shapes. What is that? Maeve asked. Ivy thought about the journal entry. The resolve. Maritime history. Marks on the cliffs. She looked at her sister and saw the same realization dawning. I think, Ivy said slowly, Uncle Dermot was looking for something. And I think he wanted us to finish what he started. They spent the first hour making the cottage habitable. Maeve swept the floor while Ivy inventoried the supplies their uncle had left behind. There were canned goods in a wooden crate, oil lamps with fresh wicks, matches in a sealed tin, and a camp stove with 2 fuel canisters. Someone had prepared this place for visitors, or perhaps for an extended stay that never happened. The journals were what fascinated Ivy most. She spread them across the table in chronological order, 5 volumes spanning nearly a decade. The earliest entries were straightforward. Descriptions of the island's features, notes on tides and weather, sketches of the coastline. But as the years progressed, the content changed. Her uncle had been researching something specific, following a trail through old records and maritime archives. One entry caught her attention. Cross-referenced the Customs House records with the Lloyd's insurance files. The resolve was carrying more than the manifest indicated. Captain's name was Hardwick, same as the island's original designation on the 1852 survey. Connection? Maeve brought over 2 cups of water from the rain barrel outside. Finding anything interesting? He was obsessed with a ship called the Resolve. Disappeared in 1847 somewhere along this coast. Shipwrecks. Maeve sat down, interested now. Was there treasure? I don't know yet. But he thought there was a connection to this island. Ivy flipped through more pages. Look at this. He drew maps, dozens of them, always marking specific points along the cliffs. The carvings we saw. Maybe we should go look before the light fails. They left the cottage and followed a narrow trail that wound through scrub brush and stunted pine trees toward the northern shore. The wind picked up as they climbed, carrying the salt smell of the ocean and the harsh cries of seabirds. The path grew steeper, forcing them to watch their footing on loose stones. The cliff face came into view gradually, a wall of grey rock that rose about 40 feet above the waterline. Ivy had brought one of the journals and her phone to photograph anything significant. As they drew closer, the marks on the rock became clearer. Definitely not natural erosion. These are deliberate, Maeve said, running her hand over a series of grooves cut into the stone. They formed a pattern, almost like an arrow pointing downward and to the left. Someone carved these. Ivy consulted the journal. Her uncle had sketched this exact symbol and labeled it Marker 1. Underneath he'd written directional. Test during low tide. What time is it? Ivy checked her phone. We've got about 3 hours until low tide. They continued along the cliff base, finding more symbols. Some were simple geometric shapes, circles, triangles, squares. Others were more complex, resembling nautical signs, or perhaps letters from an alphabet Ivy didn't recognize. Each one her uncle had documented, numbered, and analyzed. The pattern led them around a bend in the rock face to a section where the cliff had fractured at some point, creating a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a person to enter. Ivy wouldn't have noticed it at all, except that one of the carved symbols pointed directly at the opening. Should we go in? Maeve asked, peering into the darkness, not without proper light. And maybe not at all until we know what we're dealing with. But Ivy felt the pull of curiosity, the same impulse that must have driven her uncle to spend years exploring this place. They marked the location and continued their survey, photographing each symbol and comparing it to the journal entries. By the time they'd circled back toward the cottage, Ivy had counted 17 distinct carvings, all part of what seemed to be a deliberate system of markers. Back inside, they studied the photographs while eating a simple meal of canned soup heated on the camp stove. The symbols formed a path of sorts, leading from one end of the accessible shoreline to the other, always staying just above the high tide line. It's like a treasure map, Maeve said, except the map is carved into the rock itself, or directions. A way to mark safe routes, maybe. But even as Ivy said it, she felt the explanation was insufficient. These carvings had purpose beyond simple navigation. She returned to the journals, reading more carefully now. Her uncle had made the connection between the symbols and the missing ship. He'd found references in old newspapers to the resolves, cargo, officially listed as mining equipment, and dry goods bound for California during the gold rush. But he'd also found insurance documents that suggested the actual cargo was far more valuable. One passage made her breath catch. The crew never arrived in San Francisco. Ship presumed lost in a storm off the Oregon coast, but no wreckage ever found. Question, what if it never sank? What if they made landfall here, on what was then unmarked territory? Maeve looked up from her own reading. You think the ship came here? Uncle Dermot did. He thought they'd deliberately sailed here to hide something. Hide what? Ivy kept reading, turning pages faster now. The answer was there, buried in her uncle's careful research. He'd tracked down descendants of the Resolve's crew, read their family histories, pieced together fragments of stories passed down through generations. And then she found it. A page marked with a strip of red ribbon, as if her uncle had wanted someone to find this particular entry quickly. The unofficial cargo was gold. Nearly $2 million worth, valued at 1847 prices, stolen from Mexican territory during the war and being smuggled north to be sold. The captain discovered the theft and confronted the crew. There was a mutiny. Maeve was beside her now, reading over her shoulder. What happened to the gold? Dermot thought they brought it here, hid it somewhere on the island, planning to come back later when things had cooled down. But something went wrong. The crew scattered or died, and the location was lost, except for the markers, except for those. They sat in silence as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows through the cottage windows. The implications were staggering. If their uncle was right, somewhere on this island was a fortune in gold that had been hidden for over a century and a half. We need to search the crevice, Maeve said finally. That's where the markers lead. Tomorrow, when we have proper equipment and more time. Ivy was already making a mental list. Flashlights, rope, first aid supplies. They'd need to come back, spend more than just a day here. As evening fell, they lit the oil lamps and continued reading. Ivy found a passage that made her uneasy. Her uncle had written, confirmed 3 previous attempts to excavate the island. 1853, 1889, 1924. All ended within months with nothing recovered. Either they looked in the wrong places or someone didn't want the gold found. Local stories speak of curse, but more likely human interference. Descendants of the crew still in the area? That's ominous, Maeve said when Ivy read it aloud. It's also a warning. If Dermot was right, other people know about this. Or suspect. They heard the sound of an engine across the water, Captain Finnegan returning to collect them. Ivy gathered the journals she wanted to take, wrapping them carefully in a canvas bag. As she did, a folded piece of paper fell from between the pages of the final volume. It was a letter, addressed to "My dear nieces," in her uncle's handwriting. Ivy unfolded it with trembling fingers and read aloud by lamplight. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've come to see what the old fool left you. I hope you'll forgive the mystery, but I couldn't put certain things in the will where others might see them. This island holds a secret worth more than money. It holds the truth about what happened to the Resolve and her crew. And perhaps justice for a good man named Marcus Hardwick, who tried to do the right thing. I've spent years following the trail, and I believe I'm close to finding where they hid the gold. But I'm not young anymore, and there are others who've taken notice of my research. I've been followed. My home was searched while I was away. Someone wants what's buried here, and they're not particular about methods. I'm leaving this place to you because you're family, but also because you're smart and careful. If you choose to pursue this, be watchful. Trust no one too easily. And remember that some treasures come with a cost. The markers tell a story. Follow them at low tide. The answer is in the rock itself. With love, Uncle Dermot. The letter ended there, no signature beyond his name. Ivy folded it carefully and met Maeve's wide eyes. He knew something was going to happen to him, Maeve whispered. Before Ivy could respond, they heard footsteps on the porch. Captain Finnegan knocked and called out, "Ready to head back?" Ivy slipped the letter into her pocket and picked up their bags. As they left the cottage, she glanced back at the darkening cliffs and the symbols carved into stone. Somewhere out there was a truth that had cost her uncle dearly. The question was whether they had the courage to find it. On the boat ride back to Cragmore, neither sister spoke much. Finnegan seemed to sense their mood and didn't press for conversation. It wasn't until they were nearly at the harbour that Ivy noticed another boat in the distance, its lights off despite the gathering darkness. She watched it for several minutes, a shadow on the water. When she looked again, it was gone. "Captain Finnegan," she said carefully. "Does anyone else visit the island?" He didn't answer right away, his attention on navigating into the harbour. Finally he said, "Not that I know of. Why?" "Just curious." But as they tied up at the dock and gathered their things, Ivy saw him look back toward the open water, his expression troubled. He knew something, she was certain. The question was whether he'd tell them, and whether they'd want to hear the answer. They returned to the inn with minds racing and too many questions. Ivy spread the journals across the small desk in their room, while Maeve pulled up tide charts on her phone. Low tide would occur at 6:15 the next morning, early but manageable. "We need a plan," Ivy said, organizing her thoughts the way she did at work, when faced with complex filing systems. "First we get proper equipment, flashlights, rope, something to mark our progress. Second, we document everything we find. Photographs, measurements, notes. If there's really something there, we need proof. And third," Maeve looked up from her phone, "we keep this quiet. Uncle Dermot's letter said people were watching him. Until we know what we're dealing with, we don't tell anyone what we're looking for." "What about Captain Finnegan?" "He's been helpful. For now, we keep it vague. We're just exploring our inheritance, getting a feel for the place." Ivy tapped the journals. "Dermot trusted him enough to use his boat, but that doesn't mean we should share everything." They found a general store, still open near the waterfront, and purchased supplies. 2 heavy-duty flashlights, 50 feet of climbing rope, work gloves, a first-aid kit, energy bars and water bottles. The clerk, a young man with a name tag reading Josh, rang up their purchases with polite disinterest, until Maeve mentioned they'd be spending more time on Hardwick Isle. That old place. He handed over their change. "My grandfather used to tell stories about it. Said his dad worked a salvage operation there back in the day, but they gave up after a few weeks. Grounds cursed, supposedly." "What kind of salvage operation?" Ivy asked carefully. Josh shrugged. "Ship parts, I think. Or maybe they were looking for something specific. Gramps never said exactly. Just that the crew left in a hurry and wouldn't go back for any price. After they left the store, Maeve said, that matches what Uncle Dermot wrote. Someone tried in 1924, and whatever they found or didn't find scared them off." Ivy shifted the bag of supplies. "We need to be smarter than they were." That evening, Ivy created a systematic approach. She divided the accessible shoreline into a grid using landmarks from her uncle's maps, assigning each section a number. Tomorrow they'd start with the area around the crevice, working methodically to document every symbol and every possible hiding place. Maeve studied the photographs they'd taken. These symbols, some of them look like they're pointing to specific spots. "See this triangle here? And this circle? They're at different heights on the rock face, maybe marking different tide levels. Things that are only accessible at certain times, or depths. Like dig here at this depth." They stayed up late, cross-referencing the journals with their photos, building a theory about what the markers meant. By midnight, they had a working hypothesis. The symbols formed a sequential guide meant to be followed in order from one end of the shore to the other. Each marker led to the next, and the final one would indicate the hiding spot. Sleep came fitfully. Ivy dreamed of carved stones and dark water, of men with desperate eyes hiding gold in secret places. She woke before the alarm, dressed in layers against the morning chill, and found Maeve already awake, sitting by the window watching the pre-dawn light. Captain Finnegan met them at the dock at 5:30, raising an eyebrow at their equipment but saying nothing. The crossing seemed faster this time, perhaps because Ivy's mind was occupied with what they might find. The water was calmer today, the boat cutting smoothly through gentle swells. They reached the island as the sun broke the horizon, painting the cliffs in shades of gold and amber. The timing was perfect, low tide in 45 minutes. They had perhaps 3 hours before the water would rise again and cover the lower markers. Starting at the first symbol they documented yesterday, they worked their way along the shore. Each carving pointed to the next, creating a path that descended gradually toward the waterline. Ivy photographed and measured, while Maeve marked their progress on a hand-drawn map. The 11th marker led them to a section of rock that looked like solid cliff face at first glance. But when Ivy examined it more closely, using the angle of the carved arrow as a guide, she saw the irregularity. A vertical crack, barely 6 inches wide, ran from just above the waterline, up about 12 feet. "Here," she said. "This has to be it." Maeve squeezed through the gap sideways, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "There's a space back here. Not very big, but definitely not natural." Ivy followed, the rough stone scraping her shoulders even through her jacket. The crevice opened into a small chamber, perhaps 6 feet across and 8 feet deep. The floor was uneven, covered in pebbles and shells deposited by storm surges. But at the back, where the walls narrowed again, something caught the flashlight beam. Something that wasn't rock. They moved forward together, hardly breathing. Wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, now partially rotted away, was a bundle about the size of a loaf of bread. Ivy lifted it carefully, feeling the weight, the metallic clink of objects shifting inside. "Open it," Maeve whispered. With gloved hands, Ivy unwrapped the deteriorating fabric. 3 coins fell into her palm, heavy and dull with age, but unmistakably gold. Beside them was a compass, the brass corroded green, but the glass face still intact. And beneath that, a piece of paper sealed in wax, remarkably well preserved. Maeve directed her flashlight on the coins, while Ivy examined them closely. Each was stamped with an eagle and shield, dated 1847, $20 gold pieces, minted in Philadelphia. "It's real," Maeve breathed. Uncle Dermot was right. It's actually real. The paper, when Ivy carefully broke the wax seal, proved to be a fragment of a ship's manifest. The ink had faded but was still legible. "Private cargo, hold 3, 42 crates. Contents undeclared, consigned to J. Brennan, San Francisco." Below that, someone had written in a different hand, "For safekeeping until claimed. MH, Ivy said. "Marcus Hardwick," the captain Uncle Dermot mentioned. They photographed everything before carefully rewrapping the items. This wasn't the main treasure. 3 coins and a compass weren't worth hiding for over a century. But it was proof. Proof that the resolve had been here, that the gold existed, and that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. Back in the daylight, they continued following the markers. 2 more caches revealed themselves over the next hour, both small, both containing similar items: coins, a few pieces of tarnished silverware, a navigation instrument, each hidden carefully, wrapped against the elements, placed where only someone who knew the markers could find them. "These are like breadcrumbs," Maeve said as they documented the 3rd cache. "Little bits left behind to prove the story, or to keep people searching in the wrong places," Ivy countered. "If you found one of these, you might think you'd found everything and stop looking. So where's the real treasure?" That was the question. They'd followed the markers to their end, and while they'd found valuable historical artifacts and proof of the ship's presence, they hadn't found anything approaching the fortune Uncle Dermot believed was hidden here. As they prepared to return to the cottage, Ivy noticed something odd. The final marker, carved into a flat section of rock near the high tide line, was different from the others. Instead of pointing to another location, it seemed to point upward, toward the island's interior. "Maeve, look at this." Her sister came over, studied the carving. "That's not a direction toward another marker. That's a compass rose, north, south, east, west." Ivy pulled out Uncle Dermot's journal and flipped through pages until she found what she was looking for. He wrote about this. "The final marker doesn't lead to the treasure. It leads to the map." They looked at each other, the same realization dawning. The caches along the shore were confirmation, proof for the patient searcher that the story was true. But the real hiding place was somewhere else entirely, somewhere inland, and the directions to it were encoded in the markers themselves. The tide was coming in, waves already lapping at the lowest carvings. They'd have to wait for another low tide to complete their survey and measurements. But now they had a direction, a purpose beyond simple exploration. As they climbed back toward the cottage, Ivy glanced over her shoulder at the cliff face. In the morning light, the symbols looked almost alive, a message carved in stone by desperate men more than a century and a half ago. And somewhere on this island, their final secret still waited to be discovered. Back at the cottage, they spread their findings across the table. The 3 gold coins gleamed dully in the afternoon light, streaming through the windows. Ivy handled them carefully, aware she was touching something that had passed through hands long dead, that carried with it the weight of theft and mutiny and desperate decisions. "We need to secure this place," she said, looking around the cottage with new eyes. Anyone could walk in. The door had a lock, but it was old and probably easily forced. "And we need to think about security for ourselves." Maeve was examining the compass through a magnifying glass they'd found among Uncle Dermot's supplies. "You think someone might come here?" "I think someone already has. That boat we saw last night." The fact that Uncle Dermot felt watched. Ivy pulled out her phone, frowning at the single bar of reception. "Tomorrow we go back to Cragmore and see if we can get some basic security equipment. Motion sensors, maybe a trail camera. That'll look suspicious. Not if we say we're worried about vandals or wildlife. This is our property now. We have a right to protect it." They spent the afternoon organizing the cottage, making it more livable. Maeve cleared the sleeping loft, finding blankets in a sealed trunk that smelled of cedar and mothballs. Ivy catalogued the books on the shelves, discovering her uncle had accumulated an impressive library on maritime history, geology, and 19th century California. One volume in particular caught her attention, a bound collection of county records from the 1850s. Someone, presumably her uncle, had marked several pages with slips of paper. The first marked page showed a survey map of the island, dated June 1852, barely 5 years after the Resolve had vanished. The surveyor had noted several features. The cottage site marked as Stone Foundation, Origin Unknown, the cliffs, and a small notation inland that read Brass Marker, elevation 100 to 27 feet. "There's a survey marker on the island," Ivy called to Maeve. "From 1852, her sister climbed down from the loft." "Where?" "Inland near the high point. Uncle Dermot marked this page. He must have found it." They studied the old map, trying to correlate it with the modern topography. The island's highest point was visible from the cottage, a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile to the west. The map showed a direct route from the shore, following what appeared to be a natural ridgeline. "We should go look," Maeve said. "It's getting late tomorrow." But Ivy could see her sister's restlessness, the same energy she felt herself. They were so close to something significant. Every instinct said to keep searching, to follow each lead immediately. Yet she'd learned caution over the years, learned that patience often prevented mistakes. That evening, as they heated soup on the camp stove, Ivy found more marked pages in the county records. The island had changed hands 6 times between 1852 and 1900. Each new owner held the deed for less than 2 years, usually selling at a loss. The pattern was exactly as Uncle Dermot had described. Everyone who tried to do anything with the island failed or left abruptly. One entry made her pause. In 1889, a man named Josiah Crane had purchased the island as part of forming something called the Pacific Salvage Consortium. The consortium's stated purpose was recovery of maritime assets. Along the territorial coast, they'd held the island for exactly 7 months before dissolving the company and selling the property at auction. Ivy found the news, clipping tucked into the book's pages, yellowed and brittle. "Salvage operation abandoned," read the headline from a Cragmore newspaper dated October 1889. The article reported that the Pacific Salvage Consortium had ceased operations. On Hardwick Isle, after failing to locate materials of sufficient value to justify continued investment, it mentioned Josiah Crane by name, noting he had returned to San Francisco in disappointing circumstances. They were looking for the gold, Maeve said, reading over her shoulder. Just like Uncle Dermot thought, and they found nothing. Or at least, nothing they could claim publicly. Ivy set the clipping aside carefully. I want to know more about this Crane person, and this consortium. She made notes, questions to research once they had proper internet access. The cottage had no electricity beyond what the solar panels could provide, enough for lights, but not reliable enough for extended computer use. Tomorrow, they'd spend a few hours in town, using the library or a coffee shop Wi-Fi to dig deeper into the island's history. As darkness fell, they lit the oil lamps and returned to Uncle Dermot's journals. Ivy found a passage dated 8 months before his death. Legal records confirm Crane family still in region. Mitchell Crane, great-grandson, operates salvage and recovery business out of Bellingham. Submitted inquiry to county about purchasing island. Denied, not for sale per Hardwick Family Trust. Query, how much does he know? Hardwick Family Trust? Maeve looked up from her own reading. What's that? Ivy paged through the land deed documents they'd received from the lawyer. Buried in the legal language was a clause stating the property was held in trust for descendants of Captain Marcus Hardwick, with primary inheritance to pass through the female line. Uncle Dermot, it seemed, was related to Captain Hardwick through his mother's side. We're Hardwick descendants, Ivy said slowly. That's why Uncle Dermot left it to us. We're family to the captain. The implications settled over them. This wasn't just about treasure. It was about family, about a story that had been passed down through generations, waiting for someone to piece it together and finish what Captain Hardwick had started, or been prevented from completing. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on gravel, the creak of wood underweight. Someone was on the porch. Ivy reached for the flashlight, her heart hammering. Maeve moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. The footsteps moved along the porch, paused at the door. The handle rattled gently, testing the lock. Then a voice called out, familiar and welcome. Hello, it's Finnegan. Wanted to make sure you ladies were settled for the night. Ivy let out a breath and opened the door. The captain stood in the lamplight, looking apologetic. Didn't mean to startle you. Should have called out sooner. It's fine. We're just jumpy. Ivy stepped aside. Would you like to come? Finnegan entered, removing his cap. His eyes took in the table with its maps and journals, the organized supplies, the artifacts they'd carefully arranged for photography. If he was curious, he didn't show it directly. Planning to stay out here for a while? He asked. A few days, maybe? We want to really assess the property, see what needs work. Ivy chose her words carefully. The cottage is in better shape than we expected. Dermot kept it up. Used to come out here pretty regular, especially the last couple years. Finnegan's gaze settled on the gold coins, though he didn't comment. He was a good man. Careful, thoughtful, not the type to take foolish risks. There was something in his tone, a warning perhaps, or simply an observation. Ivy met his eyes and saw concern there, genuine worry. We appreciate you checking on us, she said. Can we offer you some coffee? It's instant, but it's hot. No, thank you. Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. He moved toward the door, then paused. Word of advice, if you don't mind. The island has a reputation. Most of it's nonsense, but reputations exist for reasons. People who get too interested in this place tend to attract attention. Not always the good kind. What kind of attention? Maeve asked. The kind that asks too many questions. The kind that doesn't like competition. Finnegan settled his cap back on his head. I'll be by tomorrow afternoon to check on you. You need anything before then, you use those flares. I'm not the only one who watches the water. He left, his footsteps fading down the path toward the dock. Ivy locked the door behind him and turned to find Maeve, looking troubled. He knows something, her sister said. He knows enough to be worried, which means we need to be more careful. Ivy returned to the table, studying their findings with fresh eyes. Tomorrow we find that survey marker and see what it tells us. But we also need to cover our tracks, make it look like we're just cleaning up the property. Nothing more. They worked for another hour, documenting their discoveries in a detailed log that Ivy would keep separate from the journals. Every coin photographed from multiple angles, every measurement recorded, every observation noted. If something happened to them, or to the physical evidence, at least there would be a record. Finally exhausted, they climbed to the sleeping loft. Through the small window, Ivy could see stars scattered across the black sky, brilliant and cold. Somewhere out there was the truth about the Resolve, about Captain Hardwick and his mutinous crew, about gold hidden so well it had remained concealed for generations. And somewhere, she was increasingly certain, someone else was looking for the same answers. The question was whether they'd find the treasure first, or whether they'd simply become the latest in a long line of people who'd tried and failed to unlock the island's secrets. Morning brought fog rolling in thick from the ocean, reducing visibility to barely 30 feet. Ivy woke to the sound of a foghorn in the distance and the muffled calls of seabirds. The cottage felt isolated, cut off from the world by a grey wall of moisture. They ate a quick breakfast and set out toward the island's high point, following the route indicated on the old survey map. The fog made navigation challenging, but they could track their progress by elevation and the changing terrain. The path climbed steadily through scrub vegetation and patches of exposed rock. Maeve, who was leading, stopped suddenly. There, through the fog, a glint of metal. The survey marker was exactly where the 1852 map had indicated, though time had not been kind to it. The brass stake had corroded to green and black, but the stamped numbers were still visible. U.S. Survey 1852, point elevation 127, but it was what surrounded the marker that made Ivy's breath catch. Someone had cleared the area recently, cutting back vegetation and moving stones to create a small excavation about 3 feet across and 2 feet deep. The work was methodical, careful, not the random digging of treasure hunters, but the systematic approach of someone who knew what they were looking for. Someone's been here, Maeve said unnecessarily. Ivy examined the disturbed earth. Recently. Look at the cuts on these branches. They're fresh, maybe within the last week or two. At the bottom of the excavation, partially covered with loose dirt, was a metal strongbox about the size of a briefcase. It was old, the iron eaten through with rust in places, but still intact. Someone had been in the process of extracting it, but had stopped or been interrupted before finishing the work. They looked at each other. The question was obvious. Take the box now and risk whoever had been digging here coming back to find it gone, or leave it and risk losing it to the other searcher. We take it, Ivy decided. And we work fast. They dug carefully around the box, using sticks and their gloved hands to avoid damaging whatever might be inside. The metal was cold and rough with corrosion. Ivy could see where someone had tried to force the lid, leaving scratch marks around the seam, but the lock had held. It took both of them to lift it free. The box was heavy, its contents shifting slightly with a muffled metallic sound. They carried it between them back down the trail, moving as quickly as the fog and uneven ground allowed. Back at the cottage, they placed the strongbox on the table and examined it more closely. The lock was substantial, the kind that would require either the original key or serious tools to open. Rust had fused some of the mechanism, but the basic structure remained sound. We could try to force it, Maeve suggested, and risk damaging whatever's inside. No, Ivy thought for a moment. There's a locksmith in Cragmore, the one who opened the cottage for the previous owner, according to Mr. Harrington. You want to take this into town? I want it open, and I want it done right. We'll wrap it, say it's a family heirloom we found in storage. Old locks are his specialty. Harrington mentioned it. They wrapped the strongbox in canvas and secured it with rope, disguising its shape and nature. By the time Captain Finnegan arrived at noon to check on them, they were ready to return to the mainland with a plausible story about needing supplies and wanting to do some research at the local library. Finnegan eyed their wrapped bundle but didn't ask questions. The fog was lifting as they made the crossing, revealing clear skies and a brisk wind that chopped the water into whitecaps. Ivy held the box steady on her lap, feeling the weight of it, wondering what secrets it contained. In Cragmore, they found the locksmith shop on a side street behind the hardware store. Walter Pine was a man in his 70s with steady hands and a patient manner. He examined the strongbox with professional interest, turning it over and studying the lock mechanism. 1850s, I'd say. Good iron work. They built things to last back then. He looked up at them. Family heirloom? Something like that, Ivy said. We found it in our uncle's effects. Is it possible to open without damaging it? Possible, yes. But it'll take some time. The rust has complicated things. He named a price that was reasonable, then added, I can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon if that works for you. That would be perfect, Ivy said. They left the box with him and walked to the library. A small building near the waterfront that smelled of old paper and floor polish. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Kowalski, directed them to the local history section and the microfiche reader for old newspapers. Ivy started with the Pacific Salvage Consortium, finding incorporation records from 1889. Josiah Crane had been the primary investor, along with 3 partners whose names meant nothing to her. The consortium had filed paperwork indicating their intention to recover historical maritime assets from various coastal locations. With Hardwick Isle specifically listed, the newspaper articles painted a picture of initial optimism followed by quiet failure. The consortium had brought equipment and workers to the island in March 1889. By October, they'd withdrawn completely, selling off their equipment at a loss and dissolving the partnership. No explanation was given beyond the bland statement about insufficient returns, but Ivy found something else, an obituary from 1891. Josiah Crane had died after a brief illness at age 46. The notice mentioned he was survived by a wife and 3 children, including a son named James, who would continue the family business in maritime commerce. She traced the Crane family forward through birth records, marriage licenses, and business registrations. James Crane had indeed continued in maritime work, though not salvage. His son Robert had run a shipping company. Robert's son William had operated a commercial fishing fleet. And William's son Mitchell, I found him, Ivy said, startling Maeve, who'd been reading through old survey documents. Mitchell Crane, he's the current generation, runs a company called Crane Recovery Services out of Bellingham, Washington. Specializes in maritime salvage and historical recovery. Maeve came to look at the computer screen. The company website was professional, showing photos of underwater excavations and recovered artifacts. Mitchell Crane's biography mentioned 3 generations of maritime experience and a personal interest in resolving historical mysteries along the Pacific coast. He's looking for the gold, Maeve said. Just like his great-great-grandfather, and he contacted the county about buying the island, but Uncle Dermot's trust prevented the sale. Ivy sat back, processing the implications. That excavation we found, that could have been him, or someone working for him. So what do? We document everything, we secure our legal claim, and we find the treasure before he does. Ivy heard the determination in her own voice and recognized it as something she'd inherited from people she'd never met. Captain Hardwick, who'd refused to be part of theft. Uncle Dermot, who'd spent years pursuing the truth. They spent 2 more hours researching, building a timeline of everyone who'd tried to develop or excavate the island. The pattern was consistent: initial enthusiasm, followed by either failure or suspicious circumstances. 2 owners had died in accidents. One had sold the property and moved across the country within weeks. Another had simply abandoned it, leaving the deed in default until the county reclaimed it. It's like the island doesn't want to be found, Maeve said as they walked back toward their inn, or someone's been very good at protecting it. Ivy thought about the boat they'd seen, the footsteps on the porch, the interrupted excavation. We need to be smarter. We need security on the island, and we need to work faster. That evening, they purchased motion-activated trail cameras at a sporting goods store, along with a marine radio that would let them contact the Coast Guard or Harbor Patrol if needed. The equipment wasn't cheap, eating into their limited savings, but Ivy considered it necessary insurance. Over dinner at a small restaurant, they reviewed their strategy. Tomorrow, they'd retrieve the strongbox, return to the island, install the cameras along the main approaches, and continue following the clues Uncle Dermot had left in his journals. Every day they delayed was another day for someone else to get ahead of them. What if we find it? Maeve asked suddenly. What if we actually find the gold? What do we do then? It was a question Ivy had been avoiding. The legal implications were complex. Salvage rights, historical preservation laws, potential claims from descendants of the original owners. And then there was the moral question. Stolen gold, hidden by mutineers, sought by their descendants. Who had the right to it? We'll figure that out when we get there, she said finally. First, we need to know what we're dealing with. That night, lying in bed at the inn, Ivy couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Captain Hardwick, trying to imagine the man who'd refused to transport stolen gold, who'd faced a mutiny because of his principles. He'd been someone's husband, someone's father. The locket they'd found suggested he'd left family behind, people who'd never known what happened to him. If the gold was real, if they found it, maybe it could be used to honor his memory somehow. A museum exhibit, perhaps, or a scholarship in his name. Something that would turn a story of greed and theft into something meaningful. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to grey dawn light and Maeve already dressed. Impatient to return to the locksmith, Walter Pine had the strongbox open, its lid propped back to reveal the contents. He'd cleaned the exterior rust and oiled the hinges so it moved smoothly. Remarkable piece, he said. The seal was still good, kept most of the moisture out. Whatever's inside should be in decent condition. Ivy paid him and carried the box to their car. They drove to a quiet spot overlooking the harbor before opening it fully, both of them almost afraid to see what a century and a half of secrets would reveal. The first thing Ivy saw was a bundle of letters sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. Beside them was a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked but intact. And beneath that, wrapped in what had once been fine cloth, was a silver locket on a tarnished chain. Maeve reached for the locket first, opening it carefully. Inside was a daguerreotype photograph, faded but clear, a woman with dark hair and serious eyes, and beside her, 2 young children. On the opposite side of the locket was an inscription, Honor above fortune, M.H. 1845. Marcus Hardwick, Ivy whispered. His wife and children. She turned to the letters, breaking the seal on the first one with trembling fingers. The paper was yellowed, but the ink was still legible, written in a careful hand. To my beloved Anne, it began. If you receive this, know that I have failed to return, not through choice but through necessity. The gold we carry was taken by force from those who could not defend it, and I cannot be party to such theft. I have tried to reason with the crew, but they will not listen. Tomorrow, we make landfall at an island unmarked on any chart, and there they mean to hide their fortune until such time as they can claim it safely, the letter went on, detailing Hardwick's plan to refuse participation and his fear that the crew would not let him leave alive with knowledge of their location. His final words were heartbreaking. Tell our children I love them more than life. Tell them their father chose honor when he could have chosen ease. There were 4 more letters, each one more desperate than the last. The final one was dated May 1847, written apparently in haste. They have decided. I am to be left here alone, marooned until such time as they return for the gold, if they ever do. I have perhaps a month's provisions. I pray someone finds this, that you will know I did not abandon you. The ledger was what Uncle Dermot had been searching for. It contained a detailed inventory of the Resolve's true cargo, not the official manifest, but the reality. Page after page of gold coins, bullion, gemstones, all itemized with weights and estimated values. The total came to just over $2 million in 1847 currency, and on the final page, a map, hand-drawn, showing the island's topography with specific landmarks marked. 7 locations, each noted with a symbol matching the carvings they'd found on the cliffs. And in the center at the island's heart, an X with the notation, primary cache, sealed chamber, entry coded. Ivy and Maeve stared at the map, then at each other. "He left us everything we need," Maeve said. "Uncle Dermot found this and left it where we'd discover it." "No," Ivy said slowly, understanding dawning. "Hardwick left it. This is his insurance, his proof of what happened. He hid this strong box so that someday someone would find it and know the truth." She traced the map with one finger. "Uncle Dermot spent years searching for this. He knew it existed, but he never found it himself. But someone else did. Someone who started digging at the survey marker, Mitchell Crane, or his people." Ivy made a decision. "We go back to the island today. We install those cameras, and we use this map to find what Hardwick sealed away. We finish what both of them started." Captain Finnegan agreed to take them back immediately, though the afternoon was advancing and weather was moving in. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain by evening. He helped them load their equipment, the cameras, extra supplies, and the carefully wrapped strongbox with its precious contents. "Storm's coming," he said as they cast off. "You sure you want to be out there tonight?" "We'll be fine in the cottage," Ivy assured him. "We've got everything we need." The crossing was rougher than before, the boat pitching in growing swells. By the time they reached the island's dock, the first drops of rain were falling, fat and cold. They unloaded quickly, and Finnegan secured the boat with extra lines. "I'll come for you day after tomorrow, unless you signal sooner," he said. "Radio if you need anything." They watched him motor away into the grey afternoon, then carried their supplies up to the cottage. The wind was picking up, whistling through the trees and rattling the shutters. Ivy built a fire in the fireplace, while Maeve spread Hardwick's map on the table, weighing down the corners with oil lamps. The map showed the island in remarkable detail, considering it had been drawn more than a century and a half ago. Hardwick had marked the cottage site, though it would have been just a foundation then. He'd noted the cliffs, the dock area, even the high point where they'd found the survey marker. But it was the interior markings that drew their attention. 7 symbols matched the carvings on the cliffs, positioned at specific locations around the island's perimeter. And from each of these, a line drawn toward the center, where they converged at a single point marked with an elaborate compass rose, and the words, "Primary cache, entry sequence required." "Entry sequence," Maeve said. "Like a combination. Or specific steps to follow." The 7 markers must form a code. Ivy pulled out Uncle Dermot's journals, looking for any notes about sequences or patterns. She found entries where he'd tried different combinations, different interpretations of the symbols. But nowhere did he indicate he'd solved the puzzle. The storm hit in full as darkness fell, rain hammering the roof and wind shrieking around the cottage walls. They were grateful for the solid stone construction, for the fire warming the interior, for the sense of shelter against the elements. It felt, Ivy thought, like the island itself was protecting them. They spent hours studying the map and journals by lamplight, trying to understand Hardwick's system. The symbols weren't random. Each represented a different geometric shape, and the sequence in which they appeared along the shore seemed deliberate. Triangle, circle, square, diamond, hexagon, star, and finally, the compass rose. "It's like steps in a process," Maeve said. "You have to visit them in order, maybe do something specific at each one, or the positions themselves form a pattern." Ivy overlaid the map with a piece of tracing paper and marked each symbol's location. When she connected them with lines, a shape emerged, an irregular heptagon with the primary cache at its center. The geometry was complex, but there was logic to it. Each symbol was equidistant from the center point, creating a perfect geometric pattern despite the island's irregular topography. Whoever had designed this, presumably Hardwick himself, had possessed knowledge of surveying and mathematics. "He engineered this," Ivy said with growing respect. "He didn't just hide the gold. He created a puzzle that required education to solve. Kept it safe from common thieves, but left a path for someone with the right knowledge." Around midnight, the storm began to ease. The rain settled into a steady patter, and the wind died to a constant moan. They kept working, cross-referencing every note Uncle Dermot had made, every measurement they'd taken of the cliff carvings, and then Maeve found it, a passage in the oldest journal, written in her uncle's careful hand. The symbols are not locations but bearings. Each represents a direction in degrees from true north, measured from the center point. The sequence of shapes indicates the order in which bearings must be followed. Ivy felt a rush of excitement. So we start at the center, take bearings to each symbol location in sequence, and that gives us, what? More directions? Or tells us where to dig? Or how to open a sealed chamber? Maeve was already pulling up a compass app on her phone. We'll need proper surveying equipment, or at least a good compass and measuring tape, tomorrow in daylight. We can't do this in the dark and the mud, but Ivy was already planning the approach. They'd start at the center point, indicated on Hardwick's map. Take careful bearings to each symbol location, and see what pattern emerged. She thought about Captain Hardwick creating this elaborate system, knowing he might die before anyone found it. The care he'd taken, the intelligence he'd demonstrated, it spoke to a man who believed in order and justice, who wanted the truth to be discovered eventually by someone worthy of the task. The locket lay on the table where they'd placed it, the faces of Hardwick's wife and children visible in the lamplight. Ivy picked it up gently, feeling the weight of the silver, the smoothness worn by a man's hands more than a century ago. "If we find the gold," she said quietly, "we need to make sure his family knows what happened. His descendants. They deserve to know he didn't abandon them, that he died trying to do the right thing." Maeve nodded. "We can research the family tree. There must be records, descendants still living, and whatever we find, whatever it's worth, some of it should go to them. It's what Hardwick would have wanted." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the rain drumming overhead. The cottage felt like a sanctuary, a place out of time, where past and present intersected. Ivy imagined Hardwick sitting here or near here in those final days before he died, alone, abandoned, but still holding to his principles. "Do you think he knew?" Maeve asked. "Would that someday someone would find his letters and understand?" "I think he hoped. And I think that hope kept him going when he had every reason to give up." Ivy set the locket down carefully. "That's why we can't give up either. We owe it to him, to Uncle Dermot, to see this through properly." The storm passed during the night, leaving the island washed clean and gleaming in the morning sun. They woke early, ate a quick breakfast, and gathered their equipment, compass, measuring tape, the map, and cameras to document everything they found. The center point on Hardwick's map corresponded to a level area about 200 yards inland from the cottage, marked by a distinctive rock formation, 3 boulders arranged in a triangular pattern. It took them 20 minutes to locate it, pushing through wet undergrowth and scrambling over fallen logs. The boulders were massive, each one easily twice the height of a person. They formed a natural shelter, and within the triangle they created, the ground was relatively flat and clear of vegetation. Someone had been here before. The clearing showed signs of old digging, shallow test holes that had been filled in again over time. "This is it," Ivy said, standing at the exact center of the triangle. "This is where the bearings radiate from." She took out Hardwick's map and oriented it with the compass, marking true north. Then one by one, they took bearings to where each of the 7 cliff symbols would be located. Maeve recorded the numbers: 23 degrees, 87 degrees, 134 degrees, 198 degrees, 241 degrees, 289 degrees, and finally 356 degrees. "Now what?" Maeve asked. Ivy studied the numbers, looking for the pattern. They weren't evenly distributed. Some were close together, others widely spaced. But there had to be a logic, a reason Hardwick had chosen these specific angles. Then she saw it. The numbers, when added together in sequence, totaled exactly 328 degrees. Divide by 7, and you got 189.7, almost exactly 190 degrees, which was due south plus 10 degrees. "We need to take a bearing of 190 degrees from this point," she said. "That's where the cache is." They measured carefully, using the compass and the tape measure to mark a straight line at 190 degrees from the center of the boulder triangle. The line led directly toward a low cliff face about 70 yards away, an area they'd walked past twice without noticing anything unusual. As they approached, Ivy saw what they'd missed before. The cliff face wasn't solid rock. There was a vertical crack, narrow but deep, partially hidden by an overhang. And at the base of the crack, barely visible through accumulated dirt and fallen leaves, was a stone. Not a natural stone, but a carved one. They cleared away the debris to reveal a rectangular block of granite with symbols etched into its surface. The same 7 symbols from the cliff carvings, arranged in sequence around a central compass rose. "This is it," Maeve breathed. "This is Hardwick's seal." Ivy photographed it from every angle before examining it more closely. The stone appeared to be set into the cliff face, fitted so precisely that no gaps were visible around the edges. But it wasn't mortared in place. When she pressed against it, it moved slightly. "It's designed to be removed," she said. But carefully, following some kind of sequence, they studied the symbols, comparing them to their notes and the map. Each symbol corresponded to one of the bearings they'd calculated. If they pressed them in order, following the sequence from lowest bearing to highest, Ivy touched the triangle symbol first, the one representing the 23-degree bearing. A faint click sounded from within the stone. She pressed the circle next, then the square working through the sequence. With each symbol, another click. When she pressed the 7th and final symbol, the compass rose representing the 356-degree bearing. There was a louder click, and the stone shifted outward slightly. Together, they pulled it free. The stone was heavy, requiring both of them to move it aside. Behind it was a dark opening about 3 feet square, leading into the cliff. Ivy shone her flashlight into the darkness and saw a chamber carved from the living rock, perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 feet high. And within that chamber, stacked neatly against the walls, were wooden crates, dozens of them, each one marked with the seal they'd seen on the ship's manifest. The treasure wasn't a legend. It was real, and it had been waiting here for 178 years for someone to find it. They stood in silence, the flashlight beam illuminating stacks of crates that represented more wealth than either of them could properly imagine. Ivy felt a strange detachment, as if this moment couldn't be real, as if they'd somehow stepped into a story rather than living their actual lives. "We need to document everything," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Before we touch anything, before we move anything, we photograph and record it all." They spent the next 2 hours methodically cataloguing the chamber. Every crate photographed from multiple angles, measurements of the space itself, notes on the condition of everything, the way the crates were stacked, the marks on the walls where tools had shaped the rock. Some crates were open or damaged, revealing their contents, gold coins, exactly as Hardwick's ledger had described. Others remained sealed, their contents unknown, but their weight suggesting they were equally valuable. Ivy counted 42 crates total, matching the number on the ship's manifest. "We can't move this ourselves," Maeve said, stating the obvious. "Even if we wanted to. This is tons of gold. We shouldn't move it. Not yet." Ivy sat back on her heels, thinking through the implications. "This is a major archaeological find. Historical significance beyond just the monetary value. We need experts, proper authorities, and lawyers." "Lots of lawyers. That too." Ivy looked at her sister. "But first, we need to secure this place and make sure no one else gets here before we can protect it properly." They replaced the stone seal, photographing the symbol sequence for their records. Then they installed 2 of the trail cameras nearby, positioned to capture anyone approaching the site. The 3rd camera they placed on the path from the cottage, creating a basic security system. It was mid-afternoon by the time they returned to the cottage, exhausted but energized. They'd found it, against all odds, following clues left by a man who died alone more than a century ago. They'd solved the puzzle and discovered what generations of searchers had failed to find. Ivy was organizing their photographs, when Maeve, who'd gone to the window, made a small sound of surprise. "There's a boat coming." Ivy joined her at the window. A sleek powerboat was approaching the dock, much newer and faster than Captain Finnegan's fishing vessel. Two men were visible on deck, both wearing dark jackets despite the warming afternoon. "Are we expecting anyone?" Maeve asked. "No." Ivy felt a prickle of unease. "Get the radio. And the copies of the documents, the ones we're leaving in town." While Maeve gathered their backup materials, Ivy watched the boat dock. The men moved with purpose, securing lines and stepping onto the dock with the confidence of people who belonged there. One was older, perhaps 50, with grey hair and an expensive-looking jacket. The other was younger, carrying what looked like a metal case. They started up the path toward the cottage. Ivy opened the door before they could knock, stepping out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Callahan, I'm Mitchell Crane. This is my associate, Paul Reynolds. I was hoping we could talk about your island." So this was him, the descendant of Josiah Crane, the man who'd contacted the county about purchasing the property. Ivy kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss. The island isn't for sale. I understand that. But perhaps we could talk anyway. It's a matter of some historical importance." Crane gestured toward the cottage. "May we come in?" Everything in Ivy's instinct said no, but refusing might make them suspicious, might reveal that she had something to hide. "All right, but we have plans this afternoon, so we can't talk long." Inside, Crane's eyes took in everything: the journals on the table, the maps on the walls, the organized supplies. His gaze lingered on the strongbox, though they'd removed the letters and ledger earlier and hidden them in the sleeping loft. "You've been doing research," he said, settling into one of the chairs without being invited. "Following in your uncle's footsteps. Just learning about the property," Ivy said carefully. "It's our inheritance. We want to understand its history. Your uncle and I had several conversations about this island." "Did he mention that?" Crane's tone was conversational, but there was an edge to it. He was quite knowledgeable about local maritime history, specifically about a ship called the Resolve. He kept journals, Ivy acknowledged. "We've been reading through them. Then you know what he was looking for." "What I've been looking for that matter." "What my family has been searching for since 1889. Crane leaned forward. "The gold from the Resolve is here. We both know that. Your uncle spent years proving it. I've spent considerable resources researching it, and I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for partnership in recovering it." Maeve, standing by the fireplace, said, "What kind of partnership?" "Full funding of a proper excavation, legal representation to establish salvage rights, equal split of whatever's recovered, after expenses." Crane pulled a folder from his jacket. "I've had my lawyers draw up a preliminary agreement. You'd retain ownership of the island, of course, but we'd work together to find and claim the treasure." Ivy didn't touch the folder. "That's assuming there is treasure to find. Uncle Dermot searched for years without success because he was alone and had limited resources. I have equipment, expertise, a full team ready to deploy." Crane's smile hardened. "I also have a legitimate claim to this treasure. My ancestor was part of the original salvage consortium that held rights to this island. Those rights were never formally dissolved. Your ancestor tried to excavate here and failed, then sold the property and left." Ivy met his eyes. "Whatever rights he had ended when he gave up. That's one interpretation. My lawyers have a different view." Crane stood, leaving the folder on the table. "Think about my offer. You're two young women with no experience in salvage, no resources, no legal team. Even if you found something, hypothetically speaking, you'd face years of court battles over ownership and rights. I can make that go away. We can all benefit." "We'll consider it," Ivy said, which was a polite way of saying no. Crane's expression shifted, showing something harder beneath the friendly facade. "Your uncle made a mistake in refusing to work with me. He spent his final years worried about being followed, about his research being stolen. That's no way to live, Miss Callahan. And it's not how he died either." The implication hung in the air, ugly and threatening. Maeve moved closer to Ivy, and Reynolds, who hadn't spoken, shifted position slightly. a subtle reminder that they were outnumbered. "Are you suggesting something happened to our uncle?" Ivy kept her voice steady. "I'm suggesting that treasure hunting is dangerous. People get obsessed. They take risks. Sometimes those risks don't pay off." Crane moved toward the door. "Think about my offer. I'll be in Cragmore for the next few days. You can reach me through Harrington's office." They left, and Ivy locked the door behind them. Through the window, she watched them board their boat and motor away. Only when they were out of sight did she allow herself to shake. "He threatened us," Maeve said. "He just threatened us, right? He implied our uncle's death wasn't accidental." "That's more than a threat. It's a confession." Ivy pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. "We need to get back to the mainland. We need to tell someone what we've found and what just happened. What about the treasure? If we leave, he might come back. The cameras will catch him. And we have the evidence, the letters, the ledger, proof of what happened." Ivy was already gathering the most important documents. "The treasure's been hidden for 178 years. It can wait another few days while we get proper protection." But as she organized their materials, something caught her eye. A small digital recorder tucked behind one of the journals on the shelf. It wasn't theirs. They hadn't brought a recorder to the island. With trembling hands, Ivy picked it up. It was modern, expensive-looking, with a full memory card. She pressed play, and her uncle's voice filled the cottage. Recordings he'd made over the past 3 years, documenting his research, his fears, his interactions with Mitchell Crane. The final recording was dated 2 weeks before Dermot's death. His voice sounded tired, strained. "This is my insurance policy. If something happens to me, whoever finds this needs to know the truth. Mitchell Crane has threatened me repeatedly. He's offered money, then partnership, then veiled warnings. Last week, someone searched my house while I was at the market. Yesterday I found my boat had been tampered with, the bilge pump disconnected. I'm documenting everything, leaving copies with my lawyer to be released if I die under suspicious circumstances." The recording continued, Dermot describing specific encounters with Crane, threats made, property damaged. And then, on what must have been his final visit to the island, "I've decided to leave everything to Ivy and Maeve. They're smart, capable, and more importantly, their family to Captain Hardwick through their mother's line. If anyone has the right to finish this, it's them. I'm hiding this recorder where they'll find it after they discover the strongbox. By then, they'll understand what they're dealing with. Tell them to be careful. Tell them Crane is dangerous. Tell them." The recording cut off abruptly. Ivy and Maeve looked at each other, the implications clear. Their uncle hadn't drowned accidentally. His boat had been sabotaged, and he'd known who was responsible. Mitchell Crane had killed him for refusing to share the location of the treasure, and now Crane thought the sisters would be easier to manipulate or intimidate into cooperation. "We need to go to the police," Maeve said. "Right now. We need to go to the right police. Someone who can handle this properly, who won't tip off Crane before we have protection." Ivy packed the recorder carefully, along with all the other evidence. "Captain Finnegan said he knew a detective who handled maritime crime. We'll start there." They gathered everything essential, the letters, the ledger, the map, the locket, the recorder, and all their photographs and documentation. The strongbox itself they left too heavy and bulky to carry. But they took proof of everything they'd found. The marine radio crackled to life. Captain Finnegan's voice came through, gruff but concerned. "You ladies all right out there? Saw Crane's boat heading back to harbor. Want me to come get you?" Ivy grabbed the radio. "Yes, as soon as possible. And Captain, we need to talk. About Uncle Dermot and about what we've found. On my way." 20 minutes. They used the time to install the final security camera, positioning it to watch the cottage itself. Then they secured everything they were leaving behind, including the strongbox, hiding it in a space beneath the floorboards that Uncle Dermot had apparently prepared for exactly this purpose. When Finnegan's boat appeared, they were ready. They loaded their bags and the evidence, and Ivy took one last look at the cottage. It had been their uncle's sanctuary, his base of operations for solving a mystery that had spanned more than a century. Now it would become evidence in a murder investigation. On the boat ride back, they told Finnegan everything. He listened in silence, his weathered face growing grimmer with each revelation. When they finished, he nodded slowly. I knew something wasn't right about Dermot's death. He was too careful, too experienced to drown like that. He adjusted their course slightly. My friend Detective Morrison, she's good people. Smart, thorough. She'll know how to handle this right. Can we trust her? Ivy asked. With your lives, Finnegan said simply. And that's what we're talking about now. Crane's already killed once. He won't hesitate to do it again if he thinks you're standing between him and that gold. Detective Susan Morrison met them at the harbor, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Finnegan made the introductions on the dock, and Morrison suggested they continue the conversation somewhere more private. She drove them to the police station, a small building on the edge of town that shared space with the fire department. In a quiet interview room, Ivy and Maeve laid out everything they'd found. The letters from Captain Hardwick, the ledger documenting the stolen gold, the map showing the cache location, the photographs of the sealed chamber, and finally, most damning, the recorder with Uncle Dermot's voice detailing Crane's threats and the sabotage of his boat. Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook. When they finished, she sat back and studied them for a long moment. This is substantial, she said finally. The evidence against Crane is circumstantial but compelling, and the historical significance of what you've found, that's beyond my jurisdiction, but it's massive. She tapped her pen against the notebook. Here's what concerns me most. Crane knows you're onto something. He came to the island, made his offer, implied threats. If he realizes you've actually found the treasure and are going to authorities, he'll act. Probably quickly. What do we do? Maeve asked. First, we protect you. I'm arranging for officers to watch your inn and monitor the harbor. Second, I'm contacting the FBI. This crosses state lines, involves historical theft, potential murder. It's federal jurisdiction. Morrison pulled out her phone. Third, we need to secure that island. I can get the Coast Guard to patrol the waters around it, at least temporarily. How long will all this take? Ivy felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her. They'd been running on adrenaline and determination, but reality was catching up. The protective measures start tonight. Federal involvement will take a day or two to coordinate properly. Morrison's expression softened slightly. I know this isn't what you expected when you inherited that island, but you've stumbled onto something significant, and you've handled it better than most people would have. Over the next few hours, Morrison coordinated with multiple agencies. Ivy and Maeve gave formal statements, signed documents, and provided copies of all their evidence. The originals, the letters, the ledger, the locket, were logged as evidence and secured in the station's safe. By evening, 2 patrol officers were stationed outside their inn, and the Coast Guard had dispatched a cutter to monitor the waters around Hardwick Isle. Morrison arranged for a maritime archaeologist from the State University to meet with them the next morning, along with an FBI agent specializing in historical crimes and salvage disputes. Try to get some rest, Morrison said as she drove them back to the inn. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. You'll need to give more detailed statements, work with the archaeologist on documenting the find, probably deal with the press once word gets out. The press? Ivy hadn't considered that angle. This is going to be major news. Gold from 1847, hidden treasure, murder investigation. It's got everything reporters love. Morrison pulled up in front of the inn. The FBI will help manage that, but be prepared. Your lives are about to get very public very quickly. In their room, Ivy sat on the bed and felt the full impact of the day settling over her. They'd found treasure worth millions. They'd uncovered evidence their uncle had been murdered. They'd potentially put themselves in danger from a man who'd already killed once. And now they were at the center of investigations that would involve multiple federal agencies. Are you okay? Maeve asked, sitting beside her. I don't know. This is so much bigger than I thought it would be. Ivy looked at her sister. We just wanted to see what Uncle Dermot left us. Maybe fix up the cottage, have a family place to visit. And now we're finishing what Captain Hardwick started. We're getting justice for Uncle Dermot. We're doing something that matters. Maeve took her hand. That's worth all the complications. Ivy squeezed her sister's hand, drawing strength from the contact.
You're right.
We just need to see it through. They ordered dinner from a local restaurant, neither having the energy to go out. Over Chinese food, they discussed what came next. The archaeological survey would determine the treasure's condition and historical value. Legal proceedings would establish rightful ownership and salvage rights. And the criminal investigation would determine whether Crane could be prosecuted for Dermot's death. What do you think will happen to the gold? Maeve asked, picking at her lomane, honestly. I think most of it will end up in museums or academic institutions. It's too historically significant to just liquidate. Ivy had been thinking about this. But there might be some compensation for us as finders, and definitely we should ensure some goes to Hardwick's descendants, if we can find them. That's part of what the FBI will help with. Tracing family lines, locating living relatives. Hardwick had a wife and children in 1847. There have to be descendants somewhere. A knock on the door made them both tense. But it was just one of the patrol officers, checking in to make sure they were secure for the night. The presence of police protection was both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that the danger was real. That night, Ivy dreamed of the island. But instead of the rugged, isolated place they'd explored, in her dreams, it was alive with people. Sailors hauling crates up from a hidden beach. Captain Hardwick arguing with his crew, his face desperate and determined. Uncle Dermot walking the cliffs, documenting symbols carved into stone. All of them connected across time by the same secret, the same burden of knowledge. She woke early to find Maeve already dressed, looking out the window at the harbour, where fishing boats were heading out for the day's work. The world was continuing as normal, oblivious to the fact that everything had changed. The morning brought a flurry of activity. Professor Linda Ashworth from the State University arrived first, a woman in her 60s who specialized in 19th century maritime archaeology. She was practically vibrating with excitement as Ivy and Maeve showed her the photographs and documents. "This is extraordinary," she kept saying, examining each image with a magnifying loupe. "The preservation looks remarkable. And the historical documentation, the letters, the ledger. This is the kind of primary source material we almost never have for salvage operations from this period." The FBI agent, Thomas Berkeley, was more measured but no less interested. He focused on the criminal aspects. The threats against Dermot, the sabotage of his boat, Crane's family history of pursuing the treasure. He arranged for audio experts to analyze the recorder, for document specialists to verify the authenticity of the historical materials. "We'll need to interview Crane," Berkeley said, "but we're building a case first. The stronger our evidence, the less room he has to maneuver." By noon, the team had developed a comprehensive plan. Professor Ashworth would lead a formal archaeological survey of the island, documenting not just the treasure, but the entire site as a historical location. The FBI would continue investigating Crane, including a review of Dermot's death that had been ruled accidental. And the Coast Guard would maintain security around the island, preventing unauthorized access. "What about us?" Ivy asked. "What's our role in all this?" "For now, you stay safe and available for questions," Berkeley said. "Once we've secured the site and begun formal proceedings, you'll be involved in every step. This is still your property, your discovery. But we need to do this right by the book, so there's no question about the legality of any of it." That afternoon, they watched from the harbour as a Coast Guard vessel escorted Professor Ashworth's team out to the island. Finnegan had been hired as the official transport, his knowledge of the local waters invaluable. Ivy felt a strange sense of loss watching them go. The island had been theirs, secret and private for such a brief time. Now it was becoming public property, a piece of history that belonged to everyone. "Do you regret it?" Maeve asked quietly. "Finding the treasure?" Ivy thought about it. "No, Uncle Dermot spent years on this. Captain Hardwick died for it. They deserved to have the truth known, the story told properly." She watched the boats grow smaller in the distance. "But I miss the simplicity of when it was just us trying to figure out what he'd left us." Detective Morrison joined them on the dock, holding a folder. Thought you'd want to know. The State Crime Lab fast-tracked analysis of your uncle's boat. They found evidence of tampering exactly where the recording said. The bilge pump had been deliberately disabled. Given the condition of the hull and the water intake, it would have caused flooding within minutes of launching. So it was murder, Maeve said flatly. It was murder. We're bringing formal charges against Mitchell Crane. Morrison's expression was grim. He's been arrested. His associate Reynolds is cooperating, claims he didn't know about the boat sabotage. But he's confirmed Crane's obsession with the treasure, the threats against your uncle. Relief and grief washed over Ivy in equal measure. Relief that justice was coming. Grief for the uncle she'd barely known, but had come to admire through his journals and letters. Thank you for believing us, for acting quickly. Thank your uncle for documenting everything. He built the case against Crane without even knowing it. Morrison handed over the folder. These are copies of Crane's interview. His lawyer's already trying to negotiate, which tells me they know the evidence is solid. Inside the folder were transcripts of the initial interrogation. Crane had denied everything at first, then claimed any threats were just business negotiation. But when confronted with the recording and the evidence of sabotage, his story had begun to fall apart. Reynolds had contradicted several of his statements, and a search of Crane's office had turned up research files on the island going back years, including notes about removing obstacles to acquisition. He really believed he had a right to the treasure, Ivy said, reading through the documents. Because his ancestor searched for it, he thought that gave him ownership. Entitlement and greed are a dangerous combination, Morrison said. Your uncle stood between him and what he wanted, so he removed that obstacle. He probably thought you two would be easier to manipulate or intimidate. He was wrong, Maeve said firmly. Over the next 2 days, the pace of activity increased. Professor Ashworth's team completed their initial survey and confirmed that the cache contained approximately 42 crates of gold coins, bars, and other valuables, along with personal effects from the Resolve's crew. The estimated value, adjusted for historical and numismatic significance, was approaching $50 million. The story broke in the national media on the third day. Hidden gold rush treasure, found after 178 years, read one headline. Sisters solve century-old mystery, read another. Reporters descended on Cragmore, filling the small town's hotels and restaurants. Ivy and Maeve gave one carefully managed press conference, coordinated by the FBI, then retreated from the public eye. But the attention had positive effects too. Within a week, 3 separate families had come forward with documentation proving descent from Captain Marcus Hardwick. The locket photograph helped. 2 of the families had copies of similar images, passed down through generations along with stories of an ancestor who disappeared at sea. Professor Ashworth arranged a meeting with the Hardwick descendants, a gathering that took place in the conference room of Harrington's law office. Ivy and Maeve met elderly women and middle-aged men, children and grandchildren of children, all connected by blood to the man whose principles had set this entire chain of events in motion. An elderly woman named Anne Pritchard, who was Hardwick's great-great-great-granddaughter, brought a Bible that had belonged to his wife. Inside the front cover was an inscription in faded ink. To my beloved Anne, may this comfort you in my absence. Your devoted husband Marcus. She never remarried, Anne Pritchard told them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Family stories say she believed until her death that he'd been honorable, that he hadn't abandoned them. She just never knew what happened. Now we do, Ivy said gently, and we can tell the story properly. Your ancestor was a good man who died trying to do the right thing. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed, aided by the clear documentation and Crane's arrest. The treasure was declared property of the state, with finder's fees allocated to Ivy and Maeve, and a portion set aside for distribution to verified Hardwick descendants. The island itself would remain in the Callahan sisters' ownership, but would include a small museum and memorial to Captain Hardwick and Uncle Dermot. Throughout all of this, Ivy felt like they were riding a wave they couldn't control, swept along by forces larger than themselves. But she also felt the rightness of it, the sense that they were completing something that had needed completion for a very long time. The day of Mitchell Crane's preliminary hearing arrived with grey skies and a cold wind off the ocean. Ivy and Maeve sat in the courthouse gallery, surrounded by reporters and curious locals who'd filled every available seat. This wasn't the full trial, that would come later, but it was the moment when Crane would formally answer to charges of murder. Evidence tampering and conspiracy. Detective Morrison sat with them, along with Agent Berkeley. Professor Ashworth was present as well, ready to testify about the historical significance of the find and the years of research Dermot had invested in solving the mystery. When they brought Crane in, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by orange jail scrubs and handcuffs. His expensive lawyer sat beside him, a man from Seattle whose reputation for defending white-collar criminals was well established. But even the best lawyer couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence the prosecution had assembled. The judge, a woman named Patricia Howard, who'd been on the bench for 20 years, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. She listened to the prosecution's summary of evidence, the recording of Dermot's voice documenting threats, the physical evidence of boat sabotage, Reynolds' testimony about Crane's obsession with the treasure and his violent determination to acquire it. Crane's lawyer argued for bail, citing his client's long residence in the community and lack of prior criminal record. But Agent Berkeley presented evidence that Crane had been researching offshore bank accounts and had purchased a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands, scheduled to depart 2 days after his arrest. Flight risk is substantial, Judge Howard said, denying bail. Mr. Crane will remain in custody pending trial. For the first time, Crane's composure cracked. He turned to glare at Ivy and Maeve, his face contorted with anger and something that looked like genuine disbelief. "That treasure was my family's right," he said, loud enough to carry through the courtroom. "We searched for it first. Mr. Crane, please." His lawyer put a restraining hand on his arm, but Crane shook it off. "They have no claim." "No, right, that gold belongs to—" Judge Howard's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Crane, you will remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom. Do you understand?" Crane subsided, but the hatred in his eyes didn't diminish. Ivy met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. This man had killed her uncle, had sabotaged his boat and left him to drown, all because of greed and a twisted sense of entitlement. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The hearing lasted another hour, establishing the timeline for trial and the conditions of evidence handling. When it ended, reporters surged forward, but Agent Berkeley and Detective Morrison ushered Ivy and Maeve out through a side door, avoiding the worst of the media scrum. "That went as well as we could hope," Morrison said as they reached her car. "The judge is taking this seriously, and Crane's outburst didn't help his case. What happens now?" Maeve asked. "Now we wait for trial. Could be 6 months, could be longer. But he's not going anywhere, and that's what matters." Morrison started the engine. "In the meantime, you two have other things to focus on. The island, the museum plans, the Hardwick families." She was right. The criminal case was only one part of the story. The rest, the historical preservation, the memorial, the proper distribution of the treasure, that was ongoing work that needed their attention. That afternoon, they met with Professor Ashworth and representatives from the State Historical Society at the island. Captain Finnegan ferried them across waters that had become familiar now, past the Coast Guard cutter that maintained its watch, to the dock where this had all begun. The island felt different now. No longer isolated and mysterious, it had become a work site. Graduate students were carefully excavating the chamber, documenting each crate, before it was transported to secure storage on the mainland. A small crew was reinforcing the cottage, preparing it for its new life as a visitor center and museum, but the essence of the place remained. The wind still carried the salt smell of the ocean. The gulls still cried overhead. The symbols carved into the cliff faces still marked the path that Captain Hardwick had designed. A puzzle meant to preserve truth until someone worthy could solve it. Professor Ashworth showed them the progress. We've removed 32 of the 42 crates so far. Each one is being catalogued, photographed, and secured. The coins alone number in the thousands, and many are in remarkable condition for their age. She led them to a temporary shelter where artifacts were being processed. Gold coins gleamed under worklights sorted by mint, date, and denomination. There were other items too, navigation instruments, personal effects, a ship's bell with the name Resolve cast in bronze. This bell, Professor Ashworth said reverently, is one of the most significant finds. It confirms absolutely that this was the Resolve's cargo. No room for doubt, no question of provenance. Ivy touched the bell gently, feeling the cool metal under her fingers. This had hung on Captain Hardwick's ship, had rung out watches and warnings, had been part of his daily life. And now it would tell his story to generations who would visit this place and learn what one man had sacrificed for principle. They walked to the site of the chamber, now protected by a weatherproof canopy. The stone seal that Hardwick had designed sat nearby, removed but preserved. It would be part of the museum display, along with his letters and the ledger, the locket and the map. "We're thinking of creating a full reconstruction," Professor Ashworth said, "showing how the chamber looked when you found it, with replicas of the crates in position, and then an adjoining room with the real artifacts on display, along with the story, Hardwick's story, your uncle's story." "Your story? That sounds perfect," Maeve said. The trial began on a Monday morning in September, 6 months after Crane's arrest. The courthouse was packed, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. The case had captured national attention, not just for the treasure, but for the human story at its heart. A principled sea captain, a determined researcher. 2 sisters who'd solved a mystery and brought a killer to justice. The prosecution built their case methodically over 3 weeks. They presented the recording of Dermot's voice, played in the hushed courtroom so that everyone could hear his fear and his determination to document what was happening. They brought expert testimony about the boat sabotage, showing exactly how the disabled bilge pump would have caused fatal flooding. They called Reynolds, who testified about Crane's obsession and the escalating threats. Ivy and Maeve both testified, describing their uncle's journals, the clues he'd left, and their own investigation. Ivy spoke about finding the recorder, about understanding in that moment that their uncle had been murdered. Maeve described Crane's visit to the island, the thinly veiled threats, the implication that bad things happened to people who didn't cooperate. The defense tried to argue that Dermot's death was still accidental, that the boat sabotage might have been done by someone else, that Crane's interest in the treasure was legitimate business pursuit rather than criminal obsession. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recording alone was damning, but combined with the physical proof and Reynolds' testimony, it painted an undeniable picture. Captain Finnegan testified about Dermot's skill as a boatman, his caution and experience. He wouldn't have gone out in that boat if something was wrong. He checked everything, always. And he couldn't swim, everyone knew that. He wouldn't have taken risks on the water. Professor Ashworth spoke to the years of research Dermot had invested, the scholarly approach he'd taken. This wasn't a treasure hunt to him. It was historical research, solving a mystery. He wanted to honor Captain Hardwick's memory and tell the truth about what happened. The Hardwick descendants attended every day of the trial, sitting together in quiet solidarity. And Pritchard, now in her 80s, told reporters, "This is about justice. Justice for Captain Hardwick, who died alone for doing the right thing. Justice for Mr. Dermot, who was killed for trying to tell the truth. Justice matters no matter how long it takes." The defense's case was weak, relying mostly on attacking the credibility of Reynolds and suggesting alternative scenarios that didn't hold up under cross-examination. Crane himself didn't testify. His lawyer wisely kept him off the stand, knowing his temper and sense of entitlement would only hurt his case. In his closing argument, the prosecutor addressed the jury directly. "This case is about greed, pure destructive greed. Mitchell Crane believed he had a right to treasure that wasn't his, and when Dermot Callahan stood in his way, he killed him. It's that simple and that terrible. The evidence is clear. The defendant's own words, recorded by his victim, tell you everything you need to know. Find him guilty and give the Callahan family the justice they deserve. The defense's closing was an attempt to muddy the waters, to suggest reasonable doubt where none existed. But even as the lawyer spoke, Ivy could see the jury wasn't buying it. Their faces were closed, their minds made up. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and delivered the verdict with a steady voice. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Crane slumped in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. His lawyer whispered urgently to him, but he didn't seem to hear. Ivy felt Maeve's hand find hers, squeezing tight. Judge Howard thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for the following month. As they led Crane away, he looked back one final time at Ivy and Maeve. But the hatred was gone now, replaced by defeat and the beginning of understanding that he'd destroyed his own life for gold he'd never touch. Outside the courthouse, Detective Morrison was waiting with Agent Berkeley. "Justice for Dermot," Morrison said simply, and Ivy nodded, unable to speak, past the emotion clogging her throat. The media wanted statements, but Ivy kept it brief. "Our uncle was a good man who died pursuing historical truth. Today's verdict honors his memory and ensures that what happened to him won't happen to others. We're grateful to everyone who helped bring this case to justice." That evening, they gathered at the harbor with the Hardwick descendants, Captain Finnegan, Professor Ashworth, and the legal and law enforcement team that had made this day possible. It wasn't a celebration exactly. Too much had been lost for celebration. But it was acknowledgement that justice had been served, that truth had prevailed, and Pritchard raised a glass of wine with a trembling hand to Captain Marcus Hardwick, who chose honor over fortune, to Dermot Callahan, who wouldn't give up on truth, and to Ivy and Maeve, who finished what they started. They drank to that, to memory and justice and the strange paths that history takes. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere out there was the island where all of this had begun, where secrets carved in stone had waited generations for someone to read them properly. What happens now? Maeve asked Ivy later, as they walked along the waterfront in the gathering darkness. Now we build the memorial. We tell the stories. We make sure that Captain Hardwick and Uncle Dermot are remembered the way they deserve to be. Ivy looked out at the dark water. "And we figure out what kind of lives we want to build from all of this. Good lives," Maeve said firmly. "Lives that would make them proud." That seemed like the right answer, the only answer really. They'd been given an unexpected inheritance, not just an island or treasure, but a story and a responsibility. The question now was what they'd do with it, how they'd honor the past while building their own future. 3 months after the verdict, on a clear October morning, the Hardwick Memorial and Maritime Museum opened its doors on the island. The cottage had been carefully restored, its stone walls reinforced and its interior transformed into exhibition space while maintaining the character of the original structure. Uncle Dermot's journals occupied a place of honor, displayed alongside Captain Hardwick's letters and the artifacts recovered from the chamber. Ivy stood on the cottage porch, watching as the first visitors arrived. 23 descendants of Captain Marcus Hardwick had gathered for this dedication ceremony, some traveling from across the country to be present. They ranged in age from teenagers to great-grandparents, united by blood and by a story that had finally been told in full. Anne Pritchard was there, seated in a place of honor near the entrance. She wore a brooch that had belonged to Hardwick's widow, passed down through 5 generations. Beside her sat her great-grandson, a boy of about 12, who'd written a school report on his famous ancestor and received an A. Professor Ashworth had curated the exhibition with painstaking care. The story began with the Resolve's voyage, documented through historical records and the recovered ship's bell that now hung in the central room. It continued through the mutiny, shown through Hardwicke's own words from his letters. The coded map and the 7 symbols were explained, demonstrating the captain's ingenuity and his determination that the truth be preserved. Uncle Dermot's contribution was honored in a separate section. His journals were displayed, showing the years of research and deduction. The recorder that had captured his final weeks, proving Crane's guilt, sat in a climate-controlled case. And a photograph of him, young and smiling on the island beach, reminded visitors that this wasn't just history. This was family, real people whose lives had been shaped by events from a century and a half before. The treasure itself had been divided according to the court's ruling. The coins and artifacts of greatest historical significance went to museums, the Smithsonian, the California Historical Society, several regional institutions. Each display would include the full story, ensuring that Captain Hardwicke's name and his sacrifice would be remembered. The remaining gold, after expenses and legal fees, had been distributed. Ivy and Maeve received a finder's fee that was generous but not extravagant, enough to secure their futures but not so much as to transform them into different people. The larger portion went to the Hardwicke descendants, divided equally among the 23 verified family members. For some it meant college tuition. For others, medical bills paid or mortgages satisfied. For all of them, it meant their ancestors' principles had finally yielded something tangible and good. Mitchell Crane had been sentenced to 25 years for murder. He'd appealed, of course, but the conviction stood. He would spend what remained of his productive years in prison, all because he'd believed wealth mattered more than human life. The memorial ceremony began at noon. A local minister said words about justice and memory, and Pritchard spoke, her voice quavering but strong, about what it meant to finally know what had happened to the ancestor whose disappearance had haunted her family for generations. He didn't abandon them, she said. He died honorably, and that matters. That will always matter, Ivy spoke next, keeping her remarks brief. My sister and I came here expecting very little. A patch of worthless ground, maybe a place to visit on weekends. Instead, we found a story that needed finishing, a wrong that needed righting. We're grateful we could be part of that, and we're honored that this place will now serve as a reminder that some things, honor, truth, justice, are worth more than all the gold ever mined. Maeve unveiled a bronze plaque that would be mounted beside the cottage door. It read, in memory of Captain Marcus Hardwicke, 1811-1847, who chose principle over fortune, and Dermot Callahan, 1954 to 2024, who devoted his life to revealing the truth. May their honor inspire all who visit here. After the ceremony, visitors toured the museum. Children pressed their faces against the display cases, marveling at gold coins that had been hidden for longer than anyone now alive had been born. Adults read the letters and journals, absorbing the human cost of the story. And everyone paused at the locket, looking at the daguerreotype of Hardwicke's wife and children, understanding in that moment that history wasn't just dates and events, but people with loves and losses as real as their own. Captain Finnegan had been hired as the museum's caretaker and primary guide. He'd grown up with these waters, knew the stories and the history. Now he'd ensure that new generations learned them properly. This place has always had secrets, he told visitors. Now it's got the truth instead. That's better, I think. As the afternoon wore on and visitors explored the island, Ivy and Maeve walked the paths they'd first traveled months ago. The carved symbols on the cliffs had been protected behind clear barriers, preserved for future study. The chamber where the gold had rested for 178 years was sealed again, but a replica allowed people to see how it had looked when they'd first opened it. They climbed to the high point where they'd found the survey marker. The excavation had been filled in and replanted, returning the area to something close to its natural state. But a small bench had been installed, offering a place to sit and look out over the water. Do you think we did right by them? Maeve asked. By Uncle Dermot and Captain Hardwicke? Ivy considered the question. I think we honored what they tried to do. We told the truth. We pursued justice, and we made sure their stories survived. That's what they would have wanted. Better than gold. Much better than gold. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun move across the sky. The island that had seemed worthless just months ago had become something priceless, not because of the treasure it had held, but because of the story it could now tell. A family approached along the path, parents with 2 young children. The boy was asking questions rapid fire. Were there really pirates? How much gold? Did the bad guy go to jail? His father answered patiently, turning the history into a story his son could understand and remember. That, Ivy thought, was the real inheritance. Not gold or property, but knowledge passed down, stories shared, lessons learned. Captain Hardwick had tried to teach his crew about honor and failed. Uncle Dermot had tried to reveal the truth and been killed for it. But now, finally, those lessons would reach people who could understand them, who could carry them forward. As the family moved on toward the museum, Ivy pulled out her phone and took a photograph. The island in afternoon light, the ocean beyond, the sky vast and clear. She sent it to Detective Morrison with a simple message. "Thank you for everything." The response came quickly. "You did the hard work. I just helped it along." Dermot would be proud. Maeve stood and stretched. "Ready to head back? Finnegan's supposed to give us a lift before the evening tour group arrives." In a minute, Ivy stayed seated, taking one more look at the view. She thought about inheritance again, about what people leave behind and what endures. Gold could be spent, property sold, possessions scattered. But stories lasted. Truth lasted. The choice to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything, that was what echoed through time. Finally, she stood. "Okay, let's go home. Home being the mainland or home being here?" Ivy smiled. "Both, I think. We got that apartment for now. But this place, this will always be home too. Our uncle gave us that." They walked back down toward the cottage, past visitors reading plaques and taking photographs, past the bronze memorial and through the door into the museum. Professor Ashworth was giving a talk in the main room, describing the archaeological process with enthusiasm that had the audience rapt. And Pritchard caught Ivy's eye and nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Ivy nodded back. They'd done this together, all of them, the descendants, the investigators, the historians. They'd turned a tragedy into something meaningful. Captain Finnegan was waiting at the dock. "Ready when you are, tide's turning soon." They boarded his boat, and he cast off with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this journey thousands of times. As the island receded behind them, Ivy watched. It grew smaller. The cottage and museum, the cliffs with their symbols, the high point where secrets had been buried and then revealed. "You two did good," Finnegan said over the engine's rumble. "Dermot would have been proud. Hell, I'm proud, and I barely know you." "You helped make it happen," Ivy said. "You believed us when we needed someone to." He waved that away, uncomfortable with praise. "Just did what was right, same as you." The mainland drew closer, Cragmore's familiar buildings coming into view. The town had changed for them over these months. No longer just a place they'd passed through, but somewhere that felt connected to their story. They knew the shopkeepers now, the librarian, the people at the restaurant where they'd eaten during those early, uncertain days. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the steps of her inn as they walked up from the harbour. "How'd the opening go?" "Beautiful," Maeve told her. "You should visit. It's really something special." "I will. Been meaning to get out there for years, but never had reason enough." She smiled. "Now I do." In their room, they'd kept it, a base for the frequent trips back and forth. Ivy sat at the desk and opened her laptop. The foundation they'd established was taking shape. The Hardwick Legacy Foundation, dedicated to preserving maritime history and supporting descendants of those who'd made ethical stands in difficult circumstances. There were scholarship applications to review, grant proposals to consider, educational programs to develop. It was work she'd never imagined doing. 6 months ago, she'd been filing documents at the county records office, living paycheck to paycheck, wondering if life would ever amount to more than just getting by. Now, she was helping shape something. that would outlast her, that would touch lives she'd never meet. Maeve was on her phone scrolling through messages. The documentary people want to set up an interview next week, and there's a professor from Berkeley who wants to write a book about Captain Hardwick and use our research. Tell them yes to both. The more people who hear this story, the better. They'd been careful about how the story was told, protective of both Hardwick's memory and their uncle's, but they weren't precious about it. The story belonged to everyone now, and it should be shared widely. Already there were children's books in development, a podcast series, plans for a television drama. Each telling would reach different audiences, planting seeds of understanding about the cost of principle and the value of truth. That evening, they had dinner with the Hardwick descendants who'd stayed in town. The conversation ranged from practical matters, the foundation's bylaws, the museum's operating budget, to more personal topics, stories of how the distributed money had changed lives. A young woman, Hardwick's great-great-great-great-granddaughter, talked about using her portion to attend nursing school. An older man described finally being able to retire from a job that had worn him down to nothing. "None of this would have happened without you two," Anne Pritchard said, raising her water glass in salute. "You could have just sold the island, taken whatever money you could get, walked away. Instead, you dug deeper. You honored your uncle and our ancestor both. We had good examples to follow," Ivy said simply. As the evening wound down and people headed back to their hotels, Ivy and Maeve walked along the harbour one more time. The water was calm tonight, reflecting the lights from the boats and buildings. Somewhere out there, invisible in the darkness, was the island that had changed everything. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd just ignored the inheritance?" Maeve asked. "If we'd signed the papers and never come up here?" "Sometimes. But then I think about Uncle Dermot, alone on that boat, knowing what was about to happen, and hoping someone would eventually understand. I think about Captain Hardwick writing those letters, trying to leave a record of what he'd done, and why." Ivy stopped walking, looked out at the dark water. "We were supposed to find this, not because of fate or destiny, but because we were the ones who cared enough to look and who had the right combination of stubbornness and conscience to see it through." "Sounds like something a wise grandpa would say," Ivy laughed. "Maybe I'm getting old before my time, or maybe you're just right." They stood there a while longer, two sisters at the edge of the continent, tied now to history and family, and a story that would echo long after they were gone. The inheritance they'd received had been more than property or treasure. It had been purpose and connection, and the opportunity to make things right. Eventually, they turned and walked back toward the inn. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more interviews, more planning, more work on the foundation and the museum. But tonight, they could rest knowing they'd done what needed doing. In the room, as Ivy prepared for bed, she noticed the photograph on the nightstand, the one of Uncle Dermot on the island beach, young and full of hope. She picked it up, studying his face, seeing in it echoes of determination and curiosity that she recognized in herself. "Thank you," she said quietly to the photograph, "for trusting us, for leaving us the clues, for showing us that some things are worth fighting for." No answer came, of course, but she felt a sense of peace settling over her, a certainty that they'd fulfilled the trust he'd placed in them. The treasure was found, the truth was known, justice was served, and the story would be told properly for generations to come. That was worth more than all the gold that had ever been mined or hidden or fought over. That was the real inheritance, the knowledge that you could make a difference, that you could honor the past while building something meaningful for the future, that doing the right thing mattered even when it was difficult. She set the photograph back on the nightstand and turned off the light. Through the window, she could just make out the dark line of the horizon where sea met sky. Tomorrow, with first light, the museum would open again. Visitors would come, read the plaques, see the artifacts, learn about Captain Marcus Hardwick and Dermot Callahan and the island that had kept their secrets for so long. And two sisters who'd inherited what looked like nothing had given the world something that would never lose its value. A story of honor, perseverance, and the enduring power of truth. That seemed like a good inheritance to leave behind when their own time came. For now, though, they had work to do, lives to live, and a future to build on the foundation of the past. Ivy closed her eyes and let sleep come, dreaming not of gold or treasure, but of calm waters and clear skies, of stories told and retold, of inheritance measured not in currency, but in meaning. And in those dreams, she could almost hear her uncle's voice, and behind his, the voice of a sea captain from long ago, both of them saying the same thing: "Well done, and thank you, and may your honor guide you as it guided us." The story that had begun with a letter in a forgotten island, with symbols carved in stone and secrets buried in darkness, had found its proper ending. Not an ending really, but a transformation from mystery to knowledge, from loss to legacy, from a worthless inheritance to something priceless. And that was exactly as it should be.